Picking the Minasbad Sword as your sword of choice for your Filipino martial arts practice is an excellent choice. Of all the Filipino swords that I have handled, this is the one that has created the most challenges for me in terms of increasing my kinesthetic awareness as well as optimizing my sword biomechanics. Its design is very simple and it's very elegant. But of all the Filipino swords that I have handled, it is the trickiest one simply because of the belly swell of the Minasbad. Since it does double duty, like I mentioned in my previous episode, there is a pangbukid, meaning it is for the field, so it is for field use. But there's also pangtao, the sword that you use when fighting a tao, a person. That belly swell is optimized for both. Therefore, when that sword moves, it creates a type of fierce momentum that has a cumulative effect that is surprising to my own hands. Aside from the Filipino swords that I have handled, I also have, as you can see, a collection of replica Japanese swords, which also handle very differently. But of all the swords that I have handled, the Bicolano Minasbad has, in my opinion, the greatest potential in terms of developing my kinesthetic awareness and optimized biomechanics for my Filipino martial arts practice. Many of you are very familiar with this plaque, and this plaque is a collection of the variety of swords in the southern part of the Philippines called Mindanao, specifically the Moros. So you can see almost over a dozen types of swords, from the kalis to the barong and even to the keris to the kris. So you can see that even in the southern part of the Philippines, there's a whole variety of swords and knives that they use not only for pangbukid, the field, but also for the practices of war. And this is just for the southern region. So when picking a Filipino sword for your Filipino martial arts practice, it's very important for you to be aware every region has its own sword, has its own way of fighting, and has, in my opinion, some very minor variations as it relates to the use of their specific sword. What I'm going to present to you today is my own understanding of the handling of the Minasbad sword in terms of my own estacado practice, but also in comparison to the other Filipino swords that I happen to have in my possession. This portion of the Minasbad, specifically the pommel, has two very interesting uses. The more traditional versions of it, as mentioned in my previous video, has these two sharpened ears kind of pointing out, so then that way in close quarters, it can be used not only to puncture, but also to rake across, which is a very interesting warring feature of the Bicolano warrior, who were also named by the Spaniards as the Cimarrones, meaning they were untamed and wild. Such was the warring capability and reputation of the Bicolano warriors. But there's something else that I want to point out with regards to this handle design. In some parts of Bicol, sometimes this is referred to the tikbalang, the mythological half-horse, half-human creature of Filipino mythology. Some believe that it is a dog, but some believe that it is a little more like the tikbalang, but instead of referencing the tikbalang, they call it the horse or the caballo, the horse. A more pronounced pommel on the Minasbad is called kinabayo, meaning they made it more like a horse, meaning it curved a little more. And what's interesting about this, you see this feature some more strongly pronounced and some less pronounced on the good majority of Filipino swords. You see it on this Itak Tagalog. You see it in the modern iteration of the Pinuti. This is a Zombie Tools Sharkalope. And you see it least on the Bigler Bladeworks Ginunting. The kinabayo feature of the Minasbad is important because it gives us a couple of features as it relates to its handling. In Tagalog, when we say pangtaga or panghiwa, which is to either strike or to slash, we sometimes need a little bit of assistance in terms of its retention. So the more pronounced or the more kinabayo this particular handle, should our hand slip down, this allows us the opportunity to kind of catch itself so that when it creates that kind of momentum, the kinabayo pommel can actually catch on the hand so we can retain the sword even better. The other really good feature of this is that it allows me to take my second hand and then bring it across the handle, so now I can two-handed. And again, as mentioned in my previous episode, I have to be very careful to not fully put my two hands. I'm going to half-hand it because in the traditional minasbad design, there are two pointy ears of the tikbalang pointing out, so I don't want to wrap my hand completely around. Although this is a more modern design from Ron Kazakowski's traditionalfilipinoweapons.com website, I still, when I practice with the minasbad, only half-hand it to maintain that traditional movement and biomechanical sequence. The most important feature of the minasbad that I want to translate to you, my viewers, and my subscribers, of all the Filipino swords I have ever handled, it is the one that requires the most motor coordination as it relates to moving from arm-centric movements to core-centric movements. Moving with a sword like this cannot be optimized using simply arm movements. The reason why I bring this up is because the only truly accessible Filipino martial art curriculum and platform that we have is the Filipino martial arts that is very stick-based. So if I name some of these styles, Doce Pares, Balintawak, Villabreo Largusa, Inosanto Blend, the majority of their practice happens to be practice with the stick. As a result, the majority of the biomechanics is going to be such they are going to be initiated from the hand and arm movements. Not only because of its even balance, but because of how light the stick happens to be. This is clearly not the case with the minasbad. As you can see by its design, the sword itself is not evenly distributed. As mentioned in my previous episode, this is going to be tip heavy and it's very evident in its belly swell. As a result of this, any movements that you borrow from Filipino martial arts stick fighting pedagogies are going to require a substantial amount of adjustment. The same cannot be said for the ginunting. In fact, if you're to take a look at a lot of the ginunting movements that are being used by the Recon Force Marines in the Philippines, when you see them moving with the ginunting, a lot of those movements translate very easily into stick movements. A lot of that has to do with the relatively even weight distribution of the design of the ginunting. In fact, if we were to take a look at the design comparison between a stick and a ginunting, you can see that the design is far more similar with regards to its weight distribution between the ginunting and the stick versus the minasbad and the stick. Regardless of whether you're going to own or happen to own a pangbukid minasbad or a pangtao minasbad, those are the two main features that I want you to be mindful of as it relates to your practice. Number one, how much of the pommel is kinabayo, meaning how much of it has been curved to such a degree where it allows you to slip your hand down in case you're firing a very powerful blow that creates so much momentum that your hand ends up slipping down. But also, number two, allows you to half-hand it so then it becomes a more two-handed strike. The other thing to consider is to what degree you're going to make the adjustments in your Filipino martial arts practice so that some movements are going to be core-centric and some movements are going to be arm-centric. One thing that I have found in my key learnings with the minasbad, if the arm is far more extended and a lot of the movements are wider, meaning if the movements have it so that the bicep is further away from the torso, thereby extending your lever, your fulcrum is going to be closer to your torso, i.e. your core. But if it happens to be closer to you and you're firing movements with your bicep close to your torso, something interesting happens. It doesn't necessarily become an arm-centric movement because of that belly swell. In fact, if I were to use this type of clock movement, which is a movement that we see a lot in Balintawak, Doce Pares, and also De Cuerdas, this actually puts a lot of strain on my wrist. However, it gives us this amazing opportunity to not only use the half-handing type of technique with the minasbad, but also to use the live hand to assist along the back of the sword. So now you have these blocking capabilities, but also close quarter capabilities with the minasbad. And from this position, this becomes a far more arm-centric movement and allows for very quick adjustments with the sword as it relates to both offense and defense. Although this is technically possible with the ginunting, meaning I can cross this over to one side, take my left hand, and push cut it by putting my hand on the unsharpened side of the ginunting. One of the problems with the ginunting is that because it lacks that belly swell, when I push across, it doesn't necessarily have that kind of momentum and that kind of crashing capability. Remember how the minasbad earned the nickname the kalasag breaker, the shield breaker. If I use that same exact technique to bring it across, take my left hand and then push it across, there is a substantial amount of mass on this sword, so that even if somebody defends with their sword or with their stick or some other object to try to parry this kind of strike, when you fire it with full momentum, let's say from an angle number 2, and drive it across and then push it with my left hand and then crash and sprint right forward, I can only imagine the kind of fierceness that the Bicolano warriors had when delivering a strike that came from an angle 2, driving that momentum across, and anything that came its way, even if it was blocked, you could push right across and sprint right forward. That kind of strike is so devastating. I can only imagine what it must have been like to be on the receiving end of it. I'm a big believer in Danny Nosanto's classification that there are really only 2 types of Filipino martial arts. The first one is the warring Filipino martial art that can be easily taught to people that they had just recently recruited in case they had to fight an invading group. So there was no time to learn any sinawali or any espada idaga or anything that was complex. It's going to be along the X pattern or along the triangle patterns, angle 1, angle 2, 3, and then 4. And a lot of those movements are going to be classified as warring. And then there's a second classification according to Danny Nosanto, and these are the practices that warriors had when they were not at war. This is how they kept themselves sharp. This is how they kept themselves refined, so that they can keep themselves not only in shape for war, but really super familiar with their tool. Of course, if the minasbad is something that they carried pangbukid, so that they remain familiar with the sword when they're clearing all types of vegetation. But these types of practices that I'm talking about that are a little more ornate, that require a little more motor skill, ensures that the nervous system of the warrior always stays refined and sharp, but some of these movements are not necessarily going to be as simple or as direct or even as effective as the warring types of practices that were given to the warriors in times of war. So in this episode, what I'm going to do is share with you my own understanding of moving with the Minasbad sword in the A, warring classification, but also B, refinement classification. And I will say that 99.99% of the time, we are never really going to use our sword practice in defense of our country and our home. The majority of our practice is going to be for our own enjoyment, our own development of kinesthetic awareness, and improved, optimized biomechanics as it relates to human movement. So I really hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you for letting me share. There are 2 features of the Minasbad sword that actually resist the standard stick fighting methodologies of Filipino martial arts. The first one is that belly swell, so that the balance to it is very unique. The other one is the curved caballo handle, which is not typical of Filipino sticks, which happen to be straight. When I work with the Minasbad, the balance is such so that it does not actually comply with the traditional stick fighting FMA biomechanics. So instead of fighting it because it wants to fall from one side to another, I actually work with it so that I can position myself for success. I chamber it onto my shoulder, creating this false sense of distance for my opponent, who can never really measure what the length of the sword is. From here, I fire a fulcrum strike, and that slash actually lands on a 1.5 beat measure. So this changes not only the sense of distance, but also the timing of the cuts. Still working with core-centric movements as I use my entire body to launch the strikes, but from here I can switch to arm-centric movements as I use my left hand to push across, now making it a 2-handed effort and making it an arm-centric attack. This allows me to crash the line in close quarters with pressure. So from this fulcrum shoulder position, I can also switch to a high chamber by taking my front leg to the rear leg position. So now I have 3 ranges when I'm working with this. I can use fulcrum striking, I can close the distance, but I can also do rear leg high chambering, but then on the 4th position, use my left hand to now use a half-handing capability also from close quarters, but also in long range. This is what makes the Minasbad a very unique sword because it gives me 4 ranges and several biomechanics to implement the right kind of power and the right kind of precision striking that you don't normally see with most Filipino sword designs. So let's take a look with the kind of work that I do with Howard. Normally, a tall position is advantageous to us because it creates a sense of distance. However, with using the Minasbad, it can strain my wrist. It's a very different thing when I use a fulcrum position when I chamber it on my shoulder because when I throw that shot, I can actually adjust my fulcrum so that it now bends at the hip. This allows me then to chamber it onto my left side, and when I chamber it on my left side, I can then crash the line by using my left hand to apply pressure on the spine of the blade. This is a very important tactic with the use of much heavier swords because that initial strike actually allows me to open up into close quarter opportunities. One of them is to rechamber out or to come back in with a low 2-handed strike, or I can half-hand the caballo handle and then come back out with a 2-handed strike. This makes the Minasbad very unique in terms of my personal practice with it because now I can use this capability to now rake across and weaponize my left hand. We can still use the Minasbad for long range capabilities using just the right arm, but if I want to go ahead and close the distance, I'm going to chamber it so that that fulcrum strike is going to be assisted by a kind of tackling biomechanics. So I crash the line using my shoulder to push across, then my left hand to switch leads, and then rake across. This is one of the important features and strategies of the Minasbad because by leading with that puño caballo handle, I can fake, I can create different timings, different leads, and then when I come across, I can even use my left hand for a long range powerful strike, or I can use that left hand as I crash across, putting my left hand on the spine of the sword, pressuring with the tip of the sword to penetrate through his defenses. So this creates some great opportunities to study range management and lead management opportunities because if you take a look at it from a front perspective, what you'll start to see are some right hand and left hand dynamics when you're in front of somebody who knows how to use the Minasbad. First and foremost, take a look at the left hand and it can go under the handle because once it goes under the handle, I can half hand it or I can put my left hand over and I can put pressure on the spine of the sword so that I can go into close quarters. This is a very important position to understand as I put my hand under the handle and go into half-handing position, or take my left hand over and I can put pressure on the spine for close quarters. So let's take a look at it again with Howard. As I use this fulcrum position and chamber it on my shoulder, I can use my left hand to cut across so it becomes a 2-handed strike, or I can put it on the spine and go into close quarters. So from this chambered position, it is possible to throw these very quick cuts, but then ultimately I want to be able to crash and 2-handed. So I can use these very quick cuts to create some sort of distance management, but ultimately I'm going to crash. I think that this is a sword because it was created during times where it was sword and shield mass battle tactics being implemented. It is important to remember that it's not just a cutting tool, it's not just pangbukid or pangtao, but it is also a very pressure-oriented kind of tool where it allows us to crash the line. So some faking on the outside and then some crashing once we're on the inside. So it's not just a matter of being very deceptive with that left hand. That deceptiveness sets us up so that we can either cut and slash from angles that are unexpected, but also ultimately to crash the line in order to apply the pressure needed to take advantage of whatever openings that our opponents give us. class. This is, from a dueling standpoint, one of the critical features that ultimately translate into its ultimate role, which is as a mass attack kind of tool. So remember, this was being used by the Bicolano Cimarrones so that when they were fighting on the battlefield, not only could they use the length and leverage of the tool to take care of multiple opponents from all types of situations and angles, but also to be able to use it to pressure. So I'm going to hip hinge from this position, almost a tackle position, and then crash the line once again, using the left hand to use the blade as a pressuring and cutting tool. So from an upright position and I'm long range, I can go ahead and set up a tackling type of position with that left hand and pressure with my torso along with the Minasbad blade. One of the key features of mass attacks is how we lead switch, and in this instance with the use of the Minasbad, the lead switch is important to not only close the range but to apply leverage onto the sword itself so that when we close the range we can use the edge to go ahead and apply pressure onto our opponent. So if we're using the Minasbad in this manner, we can use it to go over the spine but also to switch under. So it adds to its deceptiveness. So there's a deceptive aspect to it, there's a pressure orientation aspect to it, but also a range management feature to use an aspect of, among other things, pangamot. So it gives me this ability to use the left hand to grab the opponent and then also pull them down. So I use long range tactics, get inside, and from here, left hand, pull them straight down. And as I pull them straight down, I'm pulling them as they're being sliced open by the Minasbad sword. This is what makes it so exceptionally dangerous because of all the leverage that it can generate and the fact that it is so long and heavy that I can use it also as a shield once I'm inside, and I go ahead and use that left hand and use some of that pangamot to get inside. I can grab him and then pull him right down, and after I pull him right down, I move on to the next opponent in that mass battle situation. So let's take a look at the biomechanics and the dynamics that I'm having with this imaginary series of opponents that I have. I'm using the Minasbad as a way to control the upper level and lower level of my opponents, managing distance, making sure that I am in a hip hinge position, but whenever I'm ready to close that distance, I'm going to go ahead and use my left hand to either use some pangamot skills or to get inside, use it as a shield, and then pull them down. So from a front-facing perspective, notice how deceptive my left hand can be, so you as the opponent can never really be certain if I'm going to crash the line, as in this instance here, or if I'm going to go back out, so that now I'm using two hands and use all of that leverage and turn the sword into something of a long-range kind of tool, which makes it very devastating. So a lot of that unpredictability that comes with the design of the Minasbad, in my opinion, makes it so that we have to do a little bit more digging to really understand what the Filipino martial arts warriors had in mind when we were in fact designing the swords that we have. One of the key features of the Minasbad is the fact that unlike the Kris, it has a flat spine, so it's not a double-edged sword, which creates this kind of dynamic that we have, because if it was double-edged, we can't do half of what we're doing here. All of the half-handing, all of the control on the spine and leveraging with it, none of that is going to exist. This is why the Minasbad requires that level of study so that we can really understand what those techniques are. I mean, if we just take a look at the kind of movements that we're seeing here, these are the kind of movements that you do not see in stick-based Filipino martial arts. This makes the Minasbad one of the most educative swords that I have in my collection. It helps me understand the Filipino martial arts in a completely different level. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Stick around, stay tuned, more videos to come.